if humans end up going extinct, we'll see a marvellous new range of animal life.
Somebody will see it, not us.
Not us. But we live on a peopled planet.
That's right. No, that's the point.
And a peopled planet has come to flourish because of the habitable climate conditions of the last several thousand millennia.
It's a challenge.
And welcome to Wonder, the Planet Earth podcast for the curious. I'm Holly Cook, joined as always by fellow Earth scientist Dr. Anthony Reid. Anthony, have you been keeping well?
Thank you, Holly. I've been keeping very well. Very busy. How about you?
Yeah, I'm not bad at all. Life is trundling away well. I spent my morning looking at rocks down a very powerful microscope this morning, so I don't think it gets better.
No, that's great. Great.
But I think it's time we checked in. So we've actually just had maybe some of, I know at least your favourite conversation so far with glaciologist Hedda Anderson, with volcanologist, geochemist extraordinaire Dr. Lucy McGee. I, for one, feel like these episodes were really rich. They were emotionally rich and they were jam-packed with some fantastic science. So I kind of want to take this time to reflect with you and talk some of these things out. How do you feel about that?
Oh, I agree. I really was impressed with those conversations. Speaking with Hedda Anderson in particular, that for me, that was quite a powerful conversation. I was surprised at how impacted I was over the next few days, especially. Mm-hmm. I think it was one of those conversations where I felt anyway, I gained an entirely new perspective on I guess the world, but also climate changes and the importance of ice in our world. I think living in the driest state in the driest continent in a drought where ice is what you get out of your freezer, it's a bit kind of theoretical in a sense. So it was really great to speak with somebody who lives that that intimate connection with ice and the importance of ice, I guess, on our planet and the climate systems and so on. I thought that was really powerful. One of the big takeaways for me, though, was how unbelievably dynamic and Hedda described glaciers as like a living system, or like a living thing. And it really sparked for me reflections on just how many verbs we use to describe glaciers, right?
Yeah.
Like, The
weirdest one for me was carve. What does carve?
They carve. Yes, So that, I think, that means like bits of the glacier falling off the front of it.
Right.
I'm pretty sure that happens when you have the glacier which is flowing out onto water.
And flow, ebb and flow.
Things ebb and flow.
They deform, they melt.
They grow. There's sort of all these words that we'd normally use with living things that we also apply to glaciers. So I just thought that was really interesting to see that that connection anyway. And Hedda just lives that connection so powerfully as well.
Is that sort of what did it for you? Because it can be surprising to hear an earth scientist like yourself say that you had a transformed perspective from that conversation, because I think we're relatively familiar with what it means to have a changing earth system. So was it that ice? Was it a feeling of urgency or melancholy? Like, what got to you? Because you do know how Climate Simply 101 works. So what about this affected you?
Well, I think it's making it real. I think I've often heard people talk, professionals who communicate about climate change are often saying things like, it's not enough just to say, if you have this much ppm CO2, then you have this much ice melt, and therefore you have this much sea level rise. And, it's not enough just to give people facts, actually. Facts, listen, let's face it, we're not very well motivated by facts as human beings. We're mostly motivated by emotions, and this is, emotions are something which are fostered or enhanced or brought about by stories. And I think Hedda's story was really powerful for me anyway, for that respect. Maybe for other people it wasn't so much, but definitely for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the truth is before the chat with Hedda, because I had a similar feeling, which was it just felt like it was a feeling that lived in my body after walking away from that. It felt very heavy. But the truth is, and not to be a bit depressing, but there are so many ways I've learned that humans can exploit for the worse the planet. So like something like global warming is it's a very big thing, but I've sort of gone, there's many ways. There's many ways that humans need to improve our relationship with the earth beyond CO2 emissions. But then actually having that conversation with Hedda where we put that feeling towards watching things literally slip through your hands as they melt. Yeah, I agree. That was a well-needed reminder for me, at least, that of the pressing processes that are happening on our warming world.
Absolutely. One of the other things that impacted me was the conversation about why, like, what is the cause of that melting? And I just sort of pictured, well, maybe it's hotter, so therefore there's not as much snow. But it turns out there's actually a lot more snow falling. I know that was counterintuitive. And again, it talks to that whole idea of there's so many different feedbacks.
Yeah.
And the connection between the ocean and climate as well, which was just fascinating. But the idea that there's actually a reasonable amount, if not more, snow falling or precipitation, but that is not growing the glacier because it's just melting away before it gets time to really solidify and kind of add to the glacial mass.
Mm-hmm. And that's where I feel like I'm at what's the Dunning-Kruger effect, where I just feel like I feel like I know enough about the climate system to be overwhelmed with knowing where to start or how to start tracking different processes. So that point about interconnection and feedbacks and like non-linear feedbacks and tipping points and how oceans warming means, how oceans and precipitation and warming and all these things are linked, but it might mean cooler in other places, or it might mean drought, or it might mean more rain. And I just go, oh my God, how's it possible to understand any of this? So I kind of took that idea and did a bit of reading into Antarctica.
Great.
Because I feel like for two South Australians, we've been talking a lot about Antarctica.
It's just down the road. It's just down the road.
Especially 50 million years ago, it's just in the backyard. So I got reading this paper, and we'll pop it in the show notes, and it was called How Australia Got Its Ice. Good one, Holly. How Antarctica Got Its Ice. And in particular, I'm always the child. I was drawn to a picture, and we'll pop it up on the screen now for you guys. But it's a picture, I think, of maybe Australia and Antarctica, call it, 30, 40, 50 million years ago. Let's put it in that rough bracket. And wouldn't you know it, Antarctica is green. There is not really ice on Antarctica. There is certainly not the big continental ice sheet we see today. So I tried to understand, how did Antarctica get its ice, keeping in mind that there is feedbacks and all of this goodness, all of this stuff that interacts with each other that is hard for me to track. So I'm going to read out the abstract, Anthony, to this
Excellent.
paper.
Please do.
And then I want to actually unpack it with you. All right, here we go.
Let's try. Here we go.
Rightio. So initially, under atmospheric CO2 levels of greater than 600 parts per million, a smaller Antarctic ice sheet restricted to the terrestrial continent was highly responsive to local insulation forcing.
Ooh.
We'll get to that. A more stable continental scale ice sheet carving at the coastline didn't form until around 32.8 million years ago, coincident with the earliest time that atmospheric CO2 levels fell below 600 parts per million. Our results provide insight into the potential of the Antarctic ice sheet for threshold behaviour and have implications for its sensitivity to atmospheric CO2 concentrations above present-day levels. So
Interesting.
I actually think we can unpack this, because those sentences sum up what's going on, this confusion going on in my head, which is that threshold behaviour.
Mm-hmm.
So you have tectonics operating on a long time scale, creating oceans, creating currents, sort of playing the jigsaw puzzle of continents and ocean. You have CO2, atmospheric CO2, which either warms the atmosphere or cools the atmosphere. You have things like, we won't talk about this today, but weathering, which, even more feedbacks like the weathering of continents can have effects on how much CO2 is in the atmosphere. But what I take away from that, Anthony, and please correct me as a scientist across who's read the same abstract now, is that there can be a multitude of complex interactions going on, but there might come a threshold where things change very quickly. And in the case of the Antarctic ice sheet, it looks like that dropping below 600 parts per million atmospheric CO2 was just like the straw that broke the camel's back for a bunch of feedbacking behaviour to grow big ice sheets.
Wow. Yeah. So 600 must be some, some reason, or there's some feedback there which is triggering that. So why are they back at 32 million years? What was the reason there? Do we have some ideas? Or first of all, insulation was the first thing that I
Local
wanted to
insulation
detail.
forcing.
So insulation really means sunlight, how much sunlight. So obviously, as this Antarctica was getting further towards the South Pole, it was getting less and less sunny, right? So it's colder, and so ice was forming. Obviously, in probably the higher altitudes and so on, that'd be where you'd expect it to start, perhaps. But yeah, it looks like until about 32 million years ago, there wasn't a stable ice sheet. So maybe it ebbed and flowed a bit.
Yeah, perhaps.
Yep.
It doesn't mean it wasn't there, but it certainly was a terrestrial bit of ice, but it certainly didn't come down to to the coastline, like a continental scale coastline. It was that drop of CO2 that just went, okay, here we go, fellas.
Here we go. And so another thing about that is the tectonic setting. So I know at about that time, and certainly this image that they've provided us does show that you could have, I mean, if you were, very strong in your if you had if you had a lot of upper body strength, you probably could have paddled a boat across from what's now southern Tasmania.
You need to get your dinghy and not paddling that. It's in my dinghy.
Anyway, it's not that far. It's not although the strait would have been very windy, no doubt.
And that's between South Australia basically and old Antarctica. Yeah, you could have gotten in your dinghy if you had a bit of courage and traversed the distance.
You could have. In principle, you could have done that. And so what they're saying is about that time, this is about the time when Australia and Antarctica broke apart and kind of finally broke apart enough to to produce that circum-Antarctic polar current, which we have talked about a little bit. We talked about that in the context of Drake's passage between Antarctica and South America.
On the other side of the world.
On the other side. So there's obviously there's continental movements both in Australia and Antarctica, and there's sort of jostling between South America and Antarctica, which is facilitating the kind of oceanic current and the oceanic system, which is affecting how the ice sheet is formed as well.
But there it is.
Tectonics,
climate. I just thought, well, I don't necessarily have a clear answer, and that's okay.
Yeah, for now, that's absolutely fine. Yeah. So what did you think about, that's talking about Antarctic and ice sheet in terms of millions of years. That's crazy long time. When we were talking with Hedda, we're definitely not talking about millions. We're actually talking about decades or even years or decades. So what's your where did you go to, in your reflection, where did you go in that space?
Well, the truth of why I went to Antarctica, and I came out more confused than I left, but the truth of why I went there is because I wanted to understand the timescales that these things are operating on. Because what really stuck with me is, I think I made a comment like, you have your coffee and you go and you look at the ice crumbling in front of you, and that's seconds. And then you go onto the scale of years with emissions, and then you go onto the scale of centuries with where this all really started, industrial revolution, and that's just blink of an eye. So I wanted to understand, how long does it take to build these ice sheets versus how quickly they're
Can you melt them?
So my takeaway was getting lost in timescale and feeling a sense of sadness. Honestly, sadness at the power for humanity to alter the planet in ways that are going to be difficult to undo so quickly. And that's just, sometimes honesty is a little sad, but there you go, Anthony.
Well, it is, yeah.
That took me then, okay, you ready for where my late night Googling took me next? It was actually to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So, Anthony, I sort of had this thought for the listeners. If you're anything like me, and you're a bit, you want to know more, but I have a bad memory with numbers. So I kind of went to this report and I wrote down some things that I took away from it. And I thought, while we're here and while we're reflecting, and rather than spending a whole episode going through a report, just while we're here for a few minutes.
Sure.
Why don't I read out some of what I found? And I would like to specifically say the report itself is really accessible. So I didn't feel the need to paraphrase anything. Here's just what is in the report. Are you ready for some quick fire IPCC climate change science?
Please.
Rightio. The observed changes provide a coherent picture of a warming world, many aspects of which have now been formally attributed to human influence and human influence on the atmosphere, ocean and land components of the climate system, taken together, is assessed as unequivocal for the first time in an IPCC assessment report.
So which report are we talking about here? This is the
IPCC 6th assessment report, and the report is from the Working Group 1, which is they talk about the physical science basis. So just gathering the body of evidence or information that can speak to the natural or anthropogenic forces that are warming the world at the moment. And here it is, unequivocal human activity.
It would be really great to talk with someone, you know.
Oh my gosh, yes.
I think we do even if nobody else is listening, I would like to know more.
Our conscience.
Do you know what I mean? Like, I think this is an important conversation. And it's not something, you know, to be perfectly honest, it's not something that we necessarily have studied.
No.
Other people have,
Correct.
but it's not what we've studied. We've studied geological processes, but there's a whole interaction between that I think was really worthwhile us continuing down this path. So what else did you find
humans in the warming world? Then I found, here's my rate of change. So you know how we just got on my soapbox around the rate of change. Here's what the IPCC has to say about the rate of change. You ready? Concentrations of CO2, methane and nitrous oxide have increased to levels unprecedented in at least 800,000 years. And there's high confidence that current CO2 concentrations have not been experienced for at least 2 million years. We'll come back to that. On to the next statement. The centennial rate of change of CO2 since 1850 has no precedent in at least the past 800,000 years, and the fastest rates of change over the last 56 million years were at least a factor of 4 lower than over 1900 to 2019. And if I can have the listeners take away, and me, you know, if you wanted to lose sleep tonight, what I want you to take away from that is the rates of change here. Seeing 56 million years immediately sort of taps me on the shoulder and goes,
that's geological time, yeah.
Correct.
That's a geological process
Correct.
there, yep.
Because it is true that over Earth's 4.5 billion year history, there has been an atmosphere with a lot of CO2 in it before.
Absolutely.
Humans weren't necessarily alive in that atmosphere.
Yeah, it's not. That's exactly right, and it's not.
Gets me.
No, that's right, but it's not necessarily that we're worried about the Earth necessarily. The Earth will be fine.
The Earth will come back okay.
It'll be fine. That's not a problem. And evolution will take over, and natural selection, and global
niches will be filled when if humans end up going extinct, we'll see a marvelous new range of animal life.
Well, somebody will see it, not us.
Not us. But we live on a peopled planet.
That's right. No, that's the point.
And a peopled planet has come to flourish because of the habitable climate conditions of the last several thousand millennia. It's a challenge. It's a big challenge, society-wide challenge. A significant challenge.
We have to be totally aware of this and try and make decisions in our own personal lives and in a way we kind of influence and behave that is positive. And I'm sure most of the people who will be listening to this are in that category.
Yeah, and if nothing else, and look, if nothing else, I really believe you have to find wonder. And if nothing else, the worry that comes along with reading things like that after a conversation with Hedda filled with all of her stories around how beautiful her landscapes are, you have to find the connection in it. And I'm grateful that we have now met Hedda and we have that knowledge with us now.
And the pictures of her and her dogs on Instagram are
good. So good.
It's just I wish we could just go there and hang out, have a cup of tea one day. But anyway.
Anywho.
Amazing.
Well, now that we're feeling a bit more jovial, let's then link it back to,
yes,
we have to feign some happiness here. But then
don't have to feign anything, really.
Reading the IPCC report, you have to feign some happiness. All right. So how does this all link to glaciers, given we're all up in arms around how the climate system, trying to figure out how it even works? How does it link to glaciers? Well, I continue from the physical science basis report. Glaciers will continue to lose mass for at least several decades, even if global temperature is stabilised. And mass loss over the 21st century is virtually certain for the Greenland ice sheet and likely for the Antarctic ice sheet. If we go back to what I was saying earlier about Antarctica and how unsure we are, this is true. It is difficult for scientists to predict how the Antarctic ice sheet will behave. That is a huge uncertainty in climate models, and I found that fascinating. That's just, we have to live with that uncertainty.
Absolutely, yeah. It's such a complex system.
Absolutely. And even on ocean warming, we will lose, glacial mass is going to be lost. How does that interplay with the oceans? Well, it's virtually certain that global oceans have warmed unabated since 1970, and they've taken up more than 90% of the excess heat in the climate system, which I think is... That's
incredible, isn't it? 90? I didn't realise it was that high. I think that's one of the reasons why I was so blown away by talking with Hedda, is that she's actually looking at something that you can see. Yeah. Do you know? Whereas 90, we're not really able to feel when we go for a swim, we're not really able to feel that amount of heat that the ocean has absorbed, right?
Yeah.
Even though it's clearly the case, and there are so many kind of little signals in the way the oceans are behaving at the moment that I think probably points that. I mean, I don't know.
Well, the bleaching, so I totally agree with you. Like saying, oh, the oceans are warming, great. Like when I go for a swim, it was pretty cold. Right? So, but something like the Great Barrier Reef is really close to home. So ocean acidification and bleaching events. I think it's the ability for organisms to grow calcified material. Is this what it's linked to? That's pretty visceral. Going to the Great Barrier Reef is a absolute privilege. It's such a beautiful natural site, and that's a place you can see that warming effect.
Yeah, I also saw recently something out of the Ningaloo Reef out on the Western Australia as well. So they also were reporting coral bleaching and processes like that, which definitely they haven't observed to the extent they're experiencing now before. Another example is changes in, I know there's a story of sea urchins which have come down the eastern side of Australia and ended up in the Tasmanian waters. So they normally live up in kind of warmer waters, but they seem to have traversed Cross Bass Strait somehow. The little spiky.
Yeah.
But what they do,
didn't need a dinghy.
No, clearly, they eat kelp.
Right.
So the beautiful kelp forests out in Tasmania. So they have been actually quite heavily impacted by these sea urchins. So there's actually, that's another story we could hopefully follow up one day with somebody who knows more about it.
That's really interesting.
But that's just another example. So again, I think, back to the idea that the oceans are absorbing 90% of the excess heat has all implications on circulation. It has impacts on ocean chemistry and also the interplay between the atmosphere and the ocean. So how warm the surface temperature is, so therefore how easy it is to evaporate more material, so how much, humidity you're getting. Or you can see quite clearly how much, dynamism there is in that interrelationship.
Dynamism, that's exactly the word for it actually, Anthony. And look, I wanted to finish that sort of bait of reporting on a powerful note, on an empowered note, which is, and again, we'll put these papers in the show notes, that every degree of temperature rising matters. And if you flip that on its head, it's to say it is never too late to lose sight of the fact that things we can put the brakes on, and that will count for something. So again, from the special report on the ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate, one of the final things that we're left with is that impacts of climate-related changes in the ocean and cryosphere increasingly challenge governance efforts to develop and implement adaptation responses from local to global scales, and in some cases pushing them to their limits. People with the highest exposure and vulnerability are often those with the lowest capacity to respond. I see that as a call to arms for countries that can help, for sectors and people that can put their money where their mouth is. I see that as something extremely important, that climate change is something that it doesn't really matter where the emissions come from. It is something that transcends borders and will be felt by everyone around the world. So if we can be in a position to be acting, it is important that we do that.
So, of course, now we get into it that there's actually a whole world of politics and whatever, and that's not our wheelhouse.
No.
We're scientists, we're physical scientists. We're explaining the physical basis behind the things. It is up to people to take that information as best they can and make good choices.
Correct, because I'll finish with this. It is virtually certain that global surface temperature rise and associated changes can be limited through rapid, substantial reductions in global greenhouse gas emissions.
Yep.
Now, something that you and I have been working on in the background that I'll just quickly link here is actually working with some researchers who are at the forefront of discovering the kinds of metals and resources that will go into accelerating our clean energy technology. So again, it's a bit of a clunky link, but in my head, what I go to is solutions. So one of the biggest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions is the energy sector. So how do we begin to decarbonize our energy? And I'll just leave it. Leave it there.
There's a connection there for sure.
Correct. Dynamism, Anthony, I think you've actually just nailed the word of the last few episodes. Clearly,
it's almost like the word of the year or the word of the series.
The word of wonder.
The word of wonder is dynamism. I mean, that's the beauty of it as well. I think if the only thing we communicate in this sort of adventure of doing a podcast is that the world is not static, I think that's an achievement. Mm-hmm. Even if only a couple of people out there realise, oh yeah, of course the world is changing. Like the weather changes, right? It's dynamic. Everyone knows the weather is dynamic, but the entire globe itself, the entire thing from the core to the top of the exosphere or whatever, top of the ionosphere is completely in a state of flux and changing constantly.
State of flux.
And Lucy was a fantastic guest to talk about that from the point of view of like magma.
Did you just do the Austin Powers?
No, I wasn't trying to.
Magma.
Well, it's tempting to do that, but
Absolutely. From the position of what happens from the geological explosions of volcanoes, it's like such a flashing neon light. The world is changing, creating and destroying itself.
Absolutely.
What did you get from your reflections from Lucy then? What did you get from that?
I wished that I knew more about igneous geochemistry, to be perfectly honest, but that's an aside. But I think one of the things that Lucy talked about for me was the difference in the chemistry itself. This is really what blew me away. The difference in actually the chemistry of the magma has a huge impact on the style of process that magma undergoes. So whether it's like an explosive type eruption with pyroclastic flows, or whether it's like an oozy kind of seep of lava out onto the surface. I just think that it's just incredible to go across scales there, to think that it's actually the chemical bonds, in this case between particularly silica is one of the key elements that she talked about. But the chemical bond between silica and 4 oxygen atoms, which we call a silica tetrahedron, just that, like at the atomic scale, is what impacts and influences the whole kind of behavior.
It's the agent of change.
Yeah.
You can on that microscopic level, that is the agent of dynamism.
It's just that. So that was one of my key kind of things, like how runny a volcanic system is. Depends on the silica, just like silica. It sounds like such a boring element. Do you know what I mean? It's not like, fancy, like, I don't know, neon or, like krypton or rare earth. It's a silica, It's super important anyway.
Totally. I actually cannot believe you're bringing this up, because I spent a lot of time in the last couple months in the first 6 months of my PhD on the other side of that coin, which is actually in carbonate magmas. So it's instead of having silicate as the sort of, glue,
the binding
of the
agent,
cations in there, you actually have the carbonate anion. And again, Anthony, like literally read my mind. I've been obsessing over the delocalized electrons in the carbonate anion, because unlike silicate melts, carbonate melts aren't sticky.
Just before you go on, so it's a carbonate ion.
The carbonate anion is CO3 2-. So 1 carbon, 3 oxygens.
Thank you. And it's runny.
And it is runny.
Why?
Because of those delocalized electrons. So instead of being sort of held to 1 carbon-oxygen bond, they're sort of whizzing around the place. And it can't polymerize. So
it's amazing, isn't it?
Instead of silicate melts, which it's the degree of polymerization, in carbonate melts, they just don't polymerize at all. So they're not sticky. And in fact, it's the viscosity of water.
Wow.
So to hear you talk about
a runny magma.
No, literally. And I think I think what I read in one of these papers was that it could get from the sort of the deep mantle to the crust in an hour if it wanted to. So the runniness of magmas.
That's like 100 kilometers or more.
Yeah.
100 kilometres an hour.
It's running.
It's literally going at 100 kilometres an hour.
It's on the highway, the magma highway. Anyway, how did we get here?
I don't know, but it's good.
Oh, good stuff. Look, Anthony, I think one more thing before we say goodbye for this episode is to reference the huge and devastating earthquake that happened in Myanmar.
Very recently.
And in particular because it feels like something we can just sort of tack onto our GeoGist that we did a few weeks ago.
Yes. So the GeoGist for this episode is the Myanmar earthquake.
Yeah.
Tragic loss of life and destruction in the region. It's obviously the huge political problems in that area as well, which compound the devastation of the physical, damage that's to infrastructure and so on. But yeah, what a huge thing. And we didn't see a lot of footage coming out of Myanmar itself, obviously, but the footage we saw from Bangkok was absolutely astounding to see those big buildings either tragically collapse or swaying in the breeze. But it's so not in the breeze, like in the opposite,
swaying on the ground.
But that's actually a function of geology as well, because Bangkok sits on very shallow geology and there's a lot of water in there, so it actually behaves differently there's a lot of water in the sediments, so it actually behaves differently. Like the way seismic waves propagate through the crust, I'm not going to explain that in detail, but basically it depends on the type of material that's propagating through how big those waves get. They can actually be amplified by having very kind of, I guess, lots of water in the subsurface, and Bangkok seems to be one of those places which is susceptible to that. But it turns out that this particular earthquake was caused by a major fault in which the plate boundary, we were actually looking at the plate boundary of the Indian continent. Again, this is all back to India ploughing into Asia. And what we're doing is sliding India past Southeast Asia right at that point. It's actually one of these huge, what we call the strike slip fault, where we have the movement is parallel. The two plates are moving parallel but in opposite directions. And yeah, it went off. It went, and you can see all kinds of aftershocks along that main fault zone. Huge impact.
Yeah, what really got me was seeing you can actually see in some spatial images that displacement, and that's just, you can see a shaking building, but to see the Earth is actually like displaced, like it's literally two plates. Sorry to be geological about it, but yeah,
it is. Yeah, no, then you can see the plates. Yeah.
And again, to look at the disastrous loss and damage to human life and society. Again, it's quite a sickening thing to see. So I think important to keep talking about our understanding of why these events
occur, where they're likely to occur, and what we can expect.
And ultimately, the dynamic Earth. To your point, Anthony, reflecting on the dynamic, complicated, coupled Earth. Well, thanks for going through that. And thanks to the listeners for going on the journey. Anthony and I have to sit back and reflect on these things too. So thanks for coming along.
Thanks, Holly. Great to chat. Thank you.
Thanks.